Ruth, chapter 3, we completed verse 11 last week. Verse 11 says, "Now, my daughter, do not fear, for I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence, or a woman of strength." So he said that, and calling her that stresses the quality of Ruth's character. And that word occurs in Proverbs 12 and Proverbs 31. It's words that are reserved for the ideal wife. So what you have is Proverbs 31:10, her strength is an admirable character trait. And then throughout the verse, throughout chapter 31, they talk about some of those character strengths, such as industry in verse 13, trustworthiness in verse 11, shrewdness in verse 16, generosity toward the needy in verse 20, efficiency in verse 29. So all of those character traits there are wrapped up in excellence, or a woman of strength. The strength is made up of something, the ingredients that make her a woman of excellence, and those are some of those. So an amazing turn of events had occurred. Ruth had arrived in Bethlehem a couple of months earlier as a destitute widow and a foreigner at the mercy of the local people there in Bethlehem. In chapter 2, with no recourse but to glean in fields behind servants, she exhibits qualities that quickly arrest the attention of Boaz. She gains her reputation not by trying to be somebody or associating with the important people. Rather, it was her self-sacrificing character, personification of Israel's covenant standards. She was a model of God's character of loving kindness, of caring for Naomi, as well as Boaz. He is too. So her loving kindness and loyalty to the family of her dead husband, especially her mother-in-law, won her the praise of Boaz and all the people. And all seems to go well. All seems to be doing really well at this point, like a storybook ending, and they lived happily ever after, and you see them riding off in the sunset kind of thing. But there is a snag just below the water level. And if you're not careful, it'll shear the pin on your motor. You know what I'm talking about. Down south in lakes and stuff, there are snags that they're about this far underwater that you can't see. And if your propeller on your little motor hits that, it'll shear the pin and then you're stuck. You have no more motor. You have a motor, but the propeller doesn't go. But here, everything seems well, and I use the illustration. There's a snag just below the water level, and if they're not careful, it's going to throw them. So we'll see what that is. That comes out in verses 12 and following. In verse 12, "And now it is true," Boaz responds to her, "I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning." Just when wedding bells seemed a sure thing, Boaz uncorks a surprise. Ruth's heart must have skipped a beat as she heard, "Truly I am a redeemer, but there is one more closely related." I knew it was too good to be true. That kind of response. Boaz is to Ruth painfully honest, since she grounded her request on his position as a redeemer. In other words, Boaz is being very, very kind and truthful. I'm not going to allow you to continue to think something that might not be true. It's not true, and it might not end up the way you hope it will end up. So he's being painfully honest with her. Naomi or Ruth apparently did not know of this fact of a closer relative, that is, one who is more closely related to Elimelech and could fulfill the role of a redeemer or a Goel. There is a hierarchy of responsibility and privilege among those subject to the obligation of caring for family members in need. This one is first in line, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next. So there is a hierarchy here that's at play. As an upright Israelite, Boaz bowed to the custom and morals rather than hatching a scheme to circumvent it. Good for him. Again, Boaz is pictured as a man of integrity who trusts in the sovereignty of God. Now, oftentimes you might hear people say, well, you can trust in the sovereignty of God, but I'm telling you this, if you don't start fighting, if you don't do this, you're not going to keep your job, or you're going to lose that promotion or whatever. You got to get in there and scrap with the rest of them. And you may have to. There's nothing wrong with being wise, but you have to know where the line is crossed, and you would call that compromise, ethical compromise. You have to know where that line is at. And Boaz knew where the line was. So he remains here. He's pictured here as a man of integrity who's going to trust in the sovereignty of God. When we come to chapter 4, Ruth is really hanging. Is this going to happen to Ruth, that Boaz is going to be it? Or is Boaz going to remain a man of integrity and therefore lose Ruth? So Boaz comes to a crossroads, and he does well. So the providence of God is highlighted here. If Boaz and Ruth were to marry, God would certainly have to overcome the obstacles. He's going to have to do this. Naomi thought she had nothing in chapter 1, verse 21. Now she has one too many. She has two redeemers now. Did she not know of a closer relative? It seems unlikely, since Bethlehem is small and presumably she would have known her husband's relatives. Boaz immediately knew the complications of the request, and the closest relative seems to have been well known as well. Chapter 4 and verse 3, Boaz said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So he was aware of this. He was aware of Naomi. So this closer relative is not a stranger necessarily. So there's no indications that the close relative here had traveled from another town or was unknown to the elders of the city. Did she approach Boaz simply because she thought he was more likely to take action rather than the other relative? If so, it would mean that she simply wanted Boaz to arrange a feasible marriage for Ruth, not just one to himself. But the instructions given to Ruth were undeniably interpreted as a marriage proposal. You can't get around that. It is more unlikely Naomi did not realize what she told Ruth. All that is certain was that Naomi approached Boaz because he was a relative who treated Ruth with unusual kindness despite her Moabite background. So Boaz's instructions to Ruth at this point is to remain this night. And the word means to lodge. It's used in chapter 1 and verse 16, where Ruth committed herself to lodging wherever Naomi would lodge. This is wise, and it is clever as well. The word removed all question concerning sexual relations. Since it had no sexual connotations, the word has no sexual connotations to it at all, it removed all question concerning those actions. There would be no reason to think that, in other words. Is this scene loaded with temptation? Obviously, yes, it is loaded with temptation. But the word lodge here signifies that thrown into temptation or meeting temptation of such a setting, the two prove themselves righteous by placing integrity above passion. Whether Boaz and Ruth will marry has to wait. But in the meantime, there's no hint of scandal will complicate the matter. Now, why didn't he send her home at that point? The text doesn't say. Most commentators speculate that the reason is the potential danger of a woman out at night. Boaz was protecting her from physical harm. That's what most commentators would say. He possibly also had in mind her reputation, since if she were seen leaving, some might misinterpret her visit as a prostitute. And he didn't want to risk that as well. In any case, Boaz's suggestion is a gesture of hospitality and protection. The work of winnowing was ordinarily men's work. So a woman leaving that area would have immediately been suspect. And the plan was to wait until morning. That's what he says, verse 12. I am a closer relative. Verse 13, remain this night, and when the morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. If he does not wish to, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. So wait until morning. Two possibilities exist here. Either the closest relative will redeem Ruth, or if he refuses, Boaz will redeem her. The word redeem here means to act as a redeemer by marrying the widow of a deceased relative. It's the same sense that Ruth used the term in chapter 3 and verse 9, and the only sense in which it's been used in this context. So in circumstances that are forced upon someone, like the case with Ruth, and have to depend on relatives, it is the moral responsibility of the nearest relative to marry the widow to save her. And the purpose of this marriage is the protection and support of the widow, not the provision for an heir. In other words, the Redeemer here does not refer to a legal obligation. Naomi's instruction to Ruth in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, and Ruth's words to Boaz in verse 9 are aimed at removing the poverty and disgrace of Ruth's widowhood. What is depicted here is a voluntary moral obligation, Levite-type responsibility. This is what is going on right here. Did Boaz and Ruth become engaged on the threshing floor? Oh, there's several reasons argue against an engagement. One, Boaz did not cover Ruth per her request in verse 9. Or at least the text doesn't say so. Cover me, for you are a redeemer. There's no indication that he did. That implies they were not formally engaged. Two, Boaz's reply to Ruth in verse 11 implies more responsibilities than just marriage. Once again, one commentator said, once again, by his choice of language, the one who wrote Ruth here, our writer, strongly hints that Boaz has heard Ruth's proposal as more than a request for marriage. Boaz does not say, if he will not marry you, I will marry you. And three, the security includes social and economic provision and may include marriage. But Boaz does not agree that he can fulfill that need. There's another kinsman who is more closely related than he. That's what's going on. Verses 14 and 15. So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Again he said, give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. So taking Boaz's advice, she laid at his feet until morning. The sequence is a little confusing. On the one hand, Ruth got up before anyone could recognize her. On the other hand, Boaz says, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he is not speaking to Ruth when he says that. So look at your text and you'll see that. Ruth was obviously avoiding being recognized. The barley given to her was both a gift and evidence that she had not just come to sleep with someone. So here's an explanation of the sequence here. The sequence confusion can be answered when we understand he said. You look at your text. in verse 14. Verse 14, and he said. That phrase, he said, is most often expressed, here we go, Trish, is most often expressed by an adverbial phrase, to say in the heart. In other words, Boaz said this to himself, not out loud. To say alone. Did I just go off and came back on? In other words, Boaz said this to himself as an inner resolve. Whether Boaz said it verbally or only in his head, he knew Ruth's visit was compromising and needed to be kept private. Boaz is motivated by the wish, by the desire to protect Ruth's respectability as a woman of excellence and perhaps his own as well. So the author here is speaking and describes what Ruth did and what Boaz thought. And the two are joined by the conjunction and, which rules out Boaz's words occurring before Ruth's action. I hope that makes some sense. Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Who's he speaking to? He's not speaking to her. He's saying this to himself. The outer garment that Boaz fills with barley is a veil. Let me see. Mitz, put it all together. Mitzpachet. Mitzpachet. That's what it is. Grab your mitzpachet and open it up, and I'll fill it full of barley. It's a very rare word. It's only used elsewhere in Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 22. It's not Ruth's primary outer garment. No, she didn't take off anything and expose anything. It's not her primary outer garment. And he pours a whole bunch of grain in there. So the precise nature of it remains obscure. It appears to have been a large cloth, possibly used as a head covering. And it was large enough for Boaz to pour 6 measures, and we're looking at 18 to 30 pounds of barley into Ruth's cloak. And the barley is for Naomi, it says in verse 17. That's for Naomi. It holds 18 or 30 pounds. And I have some stuff in the footnote here about different measures and stuff. But you're looking at 20, 25 pounds of grain. So just pick up a 25-pound plate and take off your coat and put it in there and then start carrying it. And after about 10 or 15 yards, you'll switch hands. Because one hand is going to get, and then you'll start carrying it like this, because the other hand will get tired. He loaded her up with a lot of grain for Naomi. Second part of verse 17 says this is for Naomi. Now, there's something else going on here that we have to address. You see in verse 15, again, he said, "Give me the cloak that is on you and hold it." And she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. Many of the versions that we use here, New American Standard, New English Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, the Revised Standard Version, and many commentators adopt the reading, "she went." And she went into the city. And it's found in many Hebrew manuscripts, the Vulgate, other ancient manuscripts, the Syriac, some of their manuscripts. But the Masoretic text is what we rely on. If people who study these things, if you have the Masoretic text saying one thing, and then you have the Vulgate and the Syriac text saying something else, they will go with the Masoretic text. That's more reliable. It's more trustworthy. than those things. The Masoretic text has the masculine he, not she went, he, referring to Boaz. The main actor in the preceding sequence of clauses has been Boaz. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the author depicts him as eagerly going to work on her behalf. So, give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. She held it. He measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Period. Then he went into the city. Now, Naomi, why would Naomi go into the city this early in the morning? This is before everybody else gets up. She's going back, remember, so she's not seen. Barely light. Why would she go to the city? Well, the answer is the Masoretic text has the masculine he. He went into the city. What did he do? We're going to find out in chapter 4. He went and he sat by the gate and waited for that other relative to come by. Perhaps he knew that he was going to walk by, and he sat there until he came by, and then he began to talk to him. And that's in chapter 4. So eventually they both departed the threshing floor. She went first, then he likely followed her soon afterwards. Boaz, he went to town to work on the situation, and Ruth, she went back to Naomi. That's where verse 16 picks up. Verse 16 says, when she came to her mother-in-law, her mother-in-law said, how did it go, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then she said, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today. So there's a brief conversation between Naomi and Ruth, in which Ruth gives the results of the night. Naomi begins with the question, how did it go, my daughter? And Ruth responds. When Ruth responds here, did you realize? When she does, that is her last words recorded in this book. Ruth doesn't say anything in chapter 4. So the last thing Ruth says that we know of was her recounting. She told her, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. That's it. Ruth says nothing else in the remainder of the book. So Ruth responds, her last words in the book. Then Naomi's conclusion is, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. He's not going to rest until he settles that. Naomi's question is literally, who are you, my daughter? But as the name my daughter implies, the question is not asking for identification. There are unfortunately, there are commentators out there, none of the publications which I have, but there are people out there that would say, this, who are you, my daughter, implies you went out single, you came back having spent the night with the man different. But that's reading into all of this stuff, and honestly and truthfully, it's a woman commentator as well. So women commentators tend to take Ruth and they read feminism into it, and it's really ugly, distasteful, bad. I even found one of them, and I got on Amazon and gave it a scathing review. I just said, this book is not worth money, period. Don't buy it. Because she reads feminism into everything, all the comments and everything. So I hope I saved people some money. But that's some of the things, that's characteristically what they do. Ruth's quote to Boaz, do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed, he says in verse 17, brings to mind the words of Naomi in chapter 1 and verse 21. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So don't go to your mother-in-law empty. It reminds us of what Naomi said at the very beginning of the book when she returned to Bethlehem. And Boaz's insistence to take a gift to Naomi is their justification to see the gift as a sign that the resolution he has promised Ruth will also include her return to life and fullness? Question. Naomi appears confident. Verse 18, she says, wait, he's going to resolve this and he's not going to rest until he does. But our author here does not give us a single hint how and in what way Boaz will benefit Naomi, how this is going to work out. You're not supposed to know the rest of the story at this point. So we're all hanging on the edge of our seats right now. How is this going to work out? So as a conclusion to this chapter and a little bit of a summary of a character, maybe an introduction to chapter 4 if you're still awake, attention has been brought on Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. And as attention has been brought on Boaz and Ruth, Naomi has hardly figured in significantly since the end of chapter 1. But what of Naomi? The tragedy she has undergone was at least as devastating as that of Ruth's. Does she just ride off into the sunset, fade into the background, or give a good reason for a sequel? The last exchange between Naomi and Ruth is the last words that either of them will speak in the entire story. At this crucial junction of fulfillment, they both step aside. The drama ceases to be their story and becomes the story about them in chapter 4. The first act, chapter 1, ended the famine and life in Moab for Naomi and Ruth. They are economically and socially bankrupt, but they are home. The second act, chapter 2, saw Ruth gleaning in the field of Boaz and experiencing unusual kindness. The character of Boaz and Ruth are especially highlighted. Naomi catches a glimmer of hope when she finds out that the man showing kindness to Ruth is a close relative. In the end, however, the barley and the wheat harvest is over. Naomi and Ruth are still living together, and there's no prospect of the situation ending in chapter 2 and verse 23. In the third act, chapter 3, Naomi hatched a plan that would provide security for Ruth, and as it turns out, against all human odds, the plan worked. Boaz has promised to do for you, Ruth, whatever you ask. Again, the character of Boaz and Ruth is outstanding. The providence of God is clear in the motivations, plans, and actions of these people. This act concludes with Naomi's confident words that Boaz is going to work this out. He's not going to give himself rest until the whole matter is settled. Whatever the form of resolution for Naomi and Ruth looks like, it is clear that it will be soon found out. When she says, wait, he will not give rest, so it's going to be soon. So it is through faith and patience that we inherit the promises, just as an application to us. Hebrews chapter way over in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 12. Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 12, so that you will not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Now, we do know the rest of the story, but at this point, Naomi and Ruth do not. They had to wait. They had to be patient and wait on the Lord's timing. Chapter 10 and verse 36, a similar statement. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. You have need of endurance. So through faith and patience, we inherit the promises. Since Naomi and Ruth believed that Boaz would accomplish what he said he would do, they waited patiently until they received the good news, since we know the rest of the story, that Ruth will be a bride. Psalm 37, verse 5, commit your way to the Lord, trust also in him, and he will do it. Now, a summary of character. Naomi has had to endure the worst possible scenario a wife and mother could imagine. The death of her husband and all of her kids. And those of you that are moms, you can feel a glimmer of the rush that just the thought of that. My husband died, and then my 2 boys died. I have nothing. We should be very shy about correcting her, Naomi, because of her intense grief. God alone can know her situation entirely and issue the perfect response and the remedy. And while that is true, all of it, Naomi did fall apart emotionally. She came back into Bethlehem saying, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara." The Hebrew word for dignity, hadar, means, one of the words for dignity, means to ornament yourself with honor. An ornament is something you put on something for display, so you ornament yourself with honor. And often the word refers to God, and it's translated majestic in Psalm 29, verse 4, majesty in Psalm 90 and Job 40, splendor in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10, verse 19, verse 21. And it's also used with kings. It's translated majesty. God gives the king a measure of majesty. And humanity also has a measure of majesty. Psalm 8:5. What is man that you would regard him? You made him a little lower than, you gave him majesty, making him a little lower than the angels or than God. So, by virtue of being created in the likeness and image of God and having authority over the earth, there is a certain level of majesty that mankind has. Not the animals or the trees, but humanity has, according to Psalm 8:5. Dignity is also demonstrated by impressive acts or imposing character. And Naomi lost dignity because she played the victim when arriving back in Bethlehem. And all we need to do is read chapter 1 and verse 20 and 21. When she says, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So the background of that word dignity, all that to say, Naomi lost a measure of her dignity because she played the victim when arriving back in Bethlehem. Not to take anything away from her, immense grief, losing everything. But she didn't lose her God. But she acted as though she did. And she lost her dignity to a certain extent. Chapter 3 opens up with Naomi seemingly in better spirits and seeking security for Ruth. Chapter 3 opens up probably 3 months later, 4 months later, probably at the most, because there's the barley and the wheat harvest, both of them. At the end of chapter 2. So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. So you're looking at about 4 months at most. 4 months there, 3 to 4 months. She seems to be in better spirits in chapter 3. She recovered for sure, yes. And the Lord blessed her, yes. But Naomi would likely look back and there would be a shameful memory that she wished she hadn't done. There would be a memory of an act that she would like to take back and do over again. I wish I would not have said that. I wish I would not have played the victim, so to speak, like that. And it's good for us to think of that. Now, we can all look back into our lives and say, I wish I wouldn't have responded that way. That was not good. So we learn from that and live in such a way that when you look back, you don't have that shameful thought because of something you did that you shouldn't have done. That's one of the resolutions of Jonathan Edwards. I believe it's maybe 72 or 73rd resolution. To live my life in such a way that when I come to the end, I shall have no shame in looking back over my life. Great resolution. What about Ruth? Ruth was not impervious to emotional pain. She lost her husband. She had joined Elimelech's family and decided to stay with the family. She swore to never leave Naomi's side, and her resolve to stay with Naomi was firm. She would not be discouraged, even though Naomi tried to talk her into going back home. She had devoted herself to Israel's God and would not hesitate on that commitment. It was Ruth who took action by asking Naomi if she could glean among the ears of grain in chapter 2 and verse 2. She worked hard in the fields to provide food for her destitute mother-in-law. When she was treated with kindness, her response was to fall on her face, bowing to the ground. And she said to him, that's chapter 2, verse 10, she regarded herself as less than a maid. And that wasn't false humility. That wasn't demanding her rights. It wasn't a lack of dignity. She knew Boaz was offering her more than a foreigner should expect. Chapter 3 opens with Naomi giving Ruth instructions, and Ruth follows them quite closely. During the, as we noted, 3 to 4 month stay in Bethlehem, beginning at the barley harvest, chapter 1, verse 22, at the end of the wheat harvest, chapter 2, verse 23, Ruth had established the reputation of a woman of excellence, according to chapter 3, verse 11, in Bethlehem. And Boaz, finally, Boaz reflects God's character wonderfully. And you are reflecting on the things, how he treated Ruth, the foreigner. There are instructions in the law that they are to treat the stranger and the foreigner with kindness and provide for them, and he did that beyond expectations. He was very kind to her. He knew of her actions. He knew of her sacrifice, and it captured him. I'm impressed. You've got my attention. A character like that, someone who would do that, leave your home, come to a people that you have no idea who they are. And there's no hope, really, of in that society of getting a job, of doing anything. He was kind, and his workers were kind to her as well. So Boaz is not only a man of character as it is expressed to a stranger, but you see his workers talking with him, interacting with him. There's no fear, there's no intimidation, no fear on their part, no intimidation coming from Boaz. There seemingly is a mutual respect, though they understand their place. I'm the owner and you're the workers. That doesn't mean I'm not going to listen to you. You tell me the best way to do this, and I'll try to make it happen. Make it so that we can do this. But his character reflects the hesed, the loving kindness, the covenant-keeping kind of character that God displays towards Israel. Boaz is that man. So there we have the three main characters through chapter 3, chapters 1, 2, and 3. And when we come to chapter 4, we understand that chapter 3 has left matters concerning Naomi and Ruth in the hands of Boaz. Everything is in the hands of Boaz. So these two widows are sitting at home. I don't know what they're doing. Maybe storing the barley grain, trying to figure out where to store it because they can't eat that much grain at one time. But you can store it in a place where it doesn't mold. Perhaps they live in the kind of climate that they live in. It's not going to mold easy because it's very dry. So they have places to store it. But they're waiting. Everything is in the hands of Boaz. And this final act in chapter 4 brings the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz to a remarkable conclusion. There are two scenes. The first scene in verses 1 through 12 takes place at the city gates. That's the legal setting of courts. Today we go to a courthouse. In the ancient times, when you worked on legal matters, you would go to the city gate. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, a little bit. The question is, which of the two candidates, Boaz or the other kinsman, will become Ruth's security? The scenes have been leaving Moab, coming into the city, and then the scene was gleaning, Chapter 2 was all gleaning, going back home maybe and saying, this is what happened today. But here in chapter 4, it takes place in the city gates. And Naomi and Ruth they don't say anything in chapter 4. So the story is about them, not told by them. Will Ruth, and here's the question I brought up a few minutes ago. Will Ruth fall victim to her fine reputation and Boaz's integrity? Think about it this way. How could a relative turn down marriage to such a worthy woman? See what I mean? And is Boaz going to be a man of integrity? He's not going to stand up for me and suggest something and try to work this out? I mean, Naomi, you can picture Naomi's like, Boaz, you can speak. Now would be a good time to stand up and start saying something, or I'm gone with this guy I don't know. Help. So that's where the question comes. Will Ruth fall victim to her fine reputation? Who would turn away a woman like this? And Boaz's integrity. Well, it's not me. I'm not the closest. Step up, will you please? Be a man. How could the relative turn down, right? Well, the providence of God is on Boaz's side. There at the gate, he acquires the right to redeem the field of Elimelech and to marry Ruth, thus providing an heir to inherit the field and care for Naomi. And this resolves the question of a home and a husband for Ruth, the very point at issue between Naomi and the two young women raised way back in chapter 1, verses 7 through 19. Are there two more sons in my womb, and are you going to wait that long for them to grow up so that you can marry them? Here's the answer. Here's the answer right here. The second scene in verses 13 through 17 is parallel to chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. Parallel, what do you mean? There, in chapter 1, verse 19, there Naomi spoke of her bereavement and her loss to the women of Bethlehem. Now, in verses 13 through 17 of chapter 4, the women of the town celebrate the son born to Boaz and Ruth as the one who restores life and fulfills Naomi. This is the fundamental issue of the whole book right here. The filling of Naomi's emptiness and a birth of a son through whom the royal line of David will appear. Ruth and Boaz have a son by the name of Obed. And who is one of Obed's sons? Jesse. And who is one of Jesse's boys? David. That's where it comes from. That's the value here of this book. Fulfilling Naomi's emptiness and a royal line through whom David will appear. So despite the brevity and the comparison to the previous scene, this is the high point of the book. This is where David comes from. The first scene in chapter 4 divides into 3 episodes. In verses 1 and 2, Boaz convenes a legal assembly. In verses 3 through 8, he negotiates with a closer relative. And in verses 9 through 12, the legal assembly endorses the agreement and blesses Boaz. There's lots of culture stuff here. Take off your shoe. What's going on there? So there are some cultural background things that we'll get a chance to talk about. Do you want to discuss verse 1 and 2? Are you sufficiently... Silence means yes. Okay, verses 1 and 2. Boaz assembles the close relative, the elders, and the people, and he does this in verses 1 and 2. Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." They sat down. So they sat down. So here you have convening a legal assembly here. Now there is an interval of time from the events from chapter 3 to Boaz walking to the gate. This is a new scene. But by the expression of Boaz in chapter 3 and Verse 13, remain this night, and when the morning comes, if he will not redeem you, good, let him redeem you, but if he will not, I will, when the morning comes. So, and again, verse 18, Naomi is quite confident that Boaz is going to resolve this very quickly. So the new scene, it is a new scene, but by the expression of Boaz in chapter 3, verse 13, when morning comes, and Naomi's confidence in 3:18, the scene must be understood to have taken place the very next day. This is not a week later, things like that. Lie down until morning. The next day, lie down until morning. Naomi's confidence in Boaz was well placed. He went to the gate and he sat down. A designated place for gathering. Since anyone going in and out of town would have to go through the gate, it is a logical place to meet people. Now, a little bit of background about the gate. What's so big about the gate kind of thing? Well, when a city was captured, kings and officials placed their thrones and chairs at the gate in order to judge the vanquished city. References to that would be Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 15, and Jeremiah chapter 39 and verse 3. That was their practice. It's like the practice of the Romans, of the ancient armies of Romans, would be to parade captors in front of everybody to show the victory, and here's the spoil kind of idea. So they would set their thrones and their chairs at the gate, and they would judge. There are examples of administration of justice in times of peace as well. In Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 18, and Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 5, there are examples there where matters would be discussed at the gate. Judges were appointed at every gate, and the elders and the wise men sat at the gate to decide those cases. And that's where punishment and executions were meted out as well. Perhaps they would go out of the city so as no one would be defiled, out of the city gate, and then stone them. I believe that's what they do with Stephen. They take him out of the city gate, they drag him out of the city gates, and then they stone him. Some references there would be Deuteronomy 21:19 and Deuteronomy 22:15. At the gate, property exchanges could be conducted in front of witnesses. There's an example of that in Genesis 23, verse 10. It could also serve as a place of God's judgment and of death in Exodus 32, verse 26. And what has happened at the city gates in the past, for example, is this. The city gate included private areas where Joab killed Abner in 2 Samuel 3, verse 27. And where David awaited the messenger bringing news of Absalom, his son, in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 24. David mourned Absalom's death in the upper room of the gate. 2 Samuel 18:33. So the gate has a long traditional history of being the place where there are decisions are made, where the wise men gather, where executions are held. It's an important place, the gate. It's not like us, or many towns, like in the South, we had a town square. And in the center of that was the courthouse. And there were one-way roads, streets, all the way around it. So everything's centered around the courthouse. That's where decisions were made. Well, the gate served that purpose in ancient Israel. So he went to the gate and he sat down. It's a designated place for gathering. And anybody that would go in and out would have to come through that gate. So he figured, obviously he thought that he was going to see this closer relative. And as it turns out, he did. So the close relative apparently does come to the gate, and Boaz asks him to sit down. His name is not given, and some translate friend. The New American Standard translates it friend. Your translation may be something else. Some translations they have so-and-so. So Boaz spoke so he said, turn aside, so-and-so, and sit down here. It's interesting that the writer here did not mention the name of the closest relative. It's a word play. So it's intentionally left out. It's not as though the author didn't know who it was. It is intentionally left out. It's like, literally in the Hebrew, it is alimony poloni. That's what it is. Alimony poloni. Obviously, hodgepodge, that would be an English equivalent. Sit down here, hodgepodge. That's intentional, but that's what it is. The idiom alimony poloni, that idiom occurs in two other passages where it is clear that the author does not want to give the name of the place. In 1 Samuel 21:2 and 2 Kings chapter 6 and verse 8. Usually our author here is careful to give names, but here he keeps the close relative anonymous. Obviously, Boaz knows the man. Whatever the reason may not be for the anonymity, the effect is to diminish the respect in the reader's mind. Must not have been a real high character of a fella. That would be the effect on the reader. And he will, whoever this guy is, this alimony poloni, whoever this is, he will be dismissed as irrelevant very soon here. Boaz was not passive in finding the elders as he had been in finding the close relative. He sat by the gate to wait for the relative, but he proactively went and got the elders. So he took 10 men of the elders, it says here, suggests that he simply did not wait at the gate, but he called them to have them brought, to go get them, to fetch them is the word meaning. A translation, he had them brought, is likely the sense here. The number is 10, likely reflecting the care and the seriousness of the matter. So Boaz wanted there to be no questions regarding the legality, and so he amasses a legal form to ensure their decision, whatever that may be, that it would be binding. And here's 10 witnesses. You cannot escape, you cannot contravene, overturn 10 witnesses. So he wanted to be very careful about this. And in verse 8, the negotiations begin. Interesting. We'll see how they go. Looking at this a little bit more next week. Any questions?